Hello, my name is Michael Melnyk. I'm a 54-year-old son of a Ukrainian veteran of the Галичина division. I've authored 3 books on the division. The first one was published in 2002 entitled To Battle, and the second, Divisional History, was a 2-volume set published in November 2016. The first volume was on the Eastern Front, and the second volume, Stalin's Nemesis. Initially, the volume 1 concerns the administration, the political environment, the diplomacy that went on, the discussions, the exchange of documentation between the interested German parties, Governor Vector, who was the driving force behind the unit, the training, the raising of the division as a military force. That's pretty much what it was. Up until the Battle of Brody, the division was a well-equipped, well-trained military unit. The 2-volume set published in November 2016 was a follow-up to a previous book. What I attempted to do with the latest edition is to make it more personal by introducing a number of personal accounts of veterans that participated in the actions. I wanted to counterbalance the dry, somewhat academic documentation with a personal account to give it something to help a reader engage with the subject. From the outset, when I planned this series, I planned originally 3 books, one of documentation, one of photographs, and one of personal accounts. But the cost of publishing that would have been prohibitive. So ultimately, in agreement with the publisher, we decided on a 2-volume set, which would be a hybrid. It would contain the best photographs, the best accounts, and the best documentation. The documentation is essential because you need the credibility. Whenever you make a historical statement, you need the evidence to back up whatever it is you've written. Over the course of 25 years, I've probably interviewed 150 divisional veterans, officers, other ranks, and non-commissioned officers, as well as some of the people involved with the political aspects of the governing of Galicia during the German occupation in World War II. Some of the most interesting accounts have definitely been those that, well, in England, when you speak to the veterans, a large number of them seem to live in a time capsule. They have a perfect recollection of events as they left them. It's almost as if they haven't moved on with their life and they haven't really integrated into the society that they're living in, as a result of which they can often focus on things as they were, their experiences in the war, and they have a remarkable memory for detail, which has been tremendously important. It's the detail that makes the difference and that really adds a personal account to the whole issue of the Галичина division. I wrote the book because my father was a veteran of the unit. He died when I was 6 years old, and I wanted to find out what he had done or what he had experienced during the war. I didn't know much about that. When I grew up as a youngster in the United Kingdom, there was no Ukrainian community anywhere near where I live, so I was divorced from the whole culture, the language and the society and the politics. I knew very little about it. I wanted to know more about it. So it was a personal endeavor on my part to try and discover the part he had played or the circumstances that had led to him finding himself involved in the conflict. And it simply escalated from there. The more people I spoke to, the more interesting things became. The more individuals that I approached, the more I understood and appreciated pretty much everyone's experience of the war was different and unique. That being said, ultimately the people that I spoke to served in the Галичина division. There were lots of people like myself whose father remained very quiet about their activities during the war for a number of reasons, and I felt that it needed to be recorded because it's part of the legacy of the Ukrainian community in this country, a significant part. After all, the foundation of the Ukrainian community in this country really does rest on the veterans of the division who were brought here in 1947. That's the truth. The vast majority were very reticent. They were reticent because most were simple peasants who lacked education. on that basis, they didn't have a sufficient, or didn't feel they had a sufficient command of the English language to really articulate their experiences and explain them. Secondly, a lot of them had seen and experienced things that they really didn't want to remember. They were things that they wanted to put into the past, not dwell on, and they wanted to move on with their life because they didn't consider they'd ever return to Ukraine. And thirdly, I think some people don't have an interest in what has happened. They're more interested in what will happen, or their circumstances are they are now. So a combination of things really led to the fact that people were reticent to speak to me. One or two did. There were a couple of exceptions, people, extraordinary people, individuals who'd had experiences that really almost defied belief. For example, there was one chap from my father's village who had been conscripted into the Red Army. He'd been taken to Moscow, where he'd fought against the Germans. Then he'd been moved to Stalingrad. He'd been captured by the Germans at Stalingrad, taken back to a PO War W in Minsk, a PO War camp near Minsk, and the German PO War camps were pretty much open fields where people were left to starve. He escaped with a pole. He walked all the way home to his home village of Koropets with the pole. He then joined the UPA, Ukrainian Underground, and then in June 1944 he was ordered to enlist in the division in which he served until May 1945, when he surrendered to the British and ultimately was brought back to the United Kingdom as a prisoner. But it was meeting people like that and speaking to him about the experiences that he had had that really had a profound effect on me, because it was then I understood that everyone's experiences were unique, and some of them were really quite extraordinary, and I felt worth recording for the benefit of the society here. To understand the Galician division, it's imperative that you have to put it in context, and the context is the political activities and the political administration at the time the division that at the time the division evolved. It's impossible to divorce the two. The political climate at the time was Galicia had been occupied by the Poles, occupied by the Russians, and occupied by the Germans. Initially, there was some communication between the Galician or Ukrainian, Western Ukrainian authorities and the Germans, who negotiated to the formation of the division. Both parties wanted their own agenda. The Germans wanted manpower to support their crumbling Eastern Front, and the Ukrainians ultimately wanted political recognition, which was perhaps a little fanciful, but the reality is they believed they were in the best position if they formed a military unit to achieve that political end. So the whole book, the Volume 1 is set clearly in the context of the political climate of the time. From then you had the negotiations between the two parties as to what they wanted, the administration, the recruitment. Then you had the training of the division. And I did use personal accounts from recruitment, why they joined, why they enlisted, the circumstances that led to them enlisting, and they were quite varied. People that had been in the partisans and wanted to serve in a formal, recognized military unit. There were people who joined because they feared being drafted for forced labor. And there were people that joined because they were ultra-nationalists and they believed they could influence circumstances and that the division would serve Ukrainian needs ultimately. Then we had training. Then we had deployment of the first Kampfgruppe or divisional battle group in Poland, Kampfgruppe Bayersdorf. Then we had back to training, and the Volume 1 culminates in the Battle of Brody, where the division was dispatched to the Eastern Front in July or late June and July 1944 and came into conflict with a vastly overwhelming Soviet force. In some instances, people that had experienced direct personal loss at the hands of the Poles or the Soviets were the most anti-Soviet and simply would have supported or enlisted in any unit that were fighting the Russians, because as far as they were concerned, anything that was Soviet was evil. Then there were those who felt that it was more a marriage of convenience. They didn't want to serve in a German unit, but ultimately the Germans were the only people offering them any opportunity to serve and to fight against the Soviet Union. So it wasn't clear-cut. Everyone's circumstances were separate, everyone's were different, but those who had experienced a personal loss as a result of the Soviet occupation, they tended to welcome the Germans, and as far as they were concerned, anything that was German was good. But don't forget, the German philosophy for invading, that underpinned the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, was that the Slavs were Untermensch, or subhuman, and to some extent that racial attitude continued even until 1945. The Germans didn't really regard the Ukrainians as equals. They never did. They always regarded them as substandard. The fact is, the division really, in the eyes of its creators, Ukrainian creators, was really a matter of expediency. They sacrificed short-term form, i.e. wearing a German uniform, for long-term substance, i.e. ultimate political recognition. So that's a very important point. The second point is the creators of the division, the Ukrainian creators of the division, argued it would propel the question of Ukraine onto the international stage. And that's something it did as well, because at the termination of the war in May 1945, the division was certainly a talking point with Stalin, Churchill, Truman and the Pope. And to my recollection, no other single division occupied that much time for any of the main political leaders. So it achieved its end in that respect. The Soviets had occupied Western Ukraine and implemented wholesale policies of arrests, deportations and liquidation. And that did engender fanatical hatred amongst the Ukrainians of Soviet communism. So it certainly was a deciding and determining factor in the minds of many of the people that did enlist before Brody. The German and Ukrainian objectives were diametrically opposed. The Ukrainians sought to exploit, the Germans sought to exploit the Ukrainian hatred of Soviet communism to gain additional manpower, because they weren't in a position by 1943 where they could possibly win the war without additional help. And the Ukrainian supported the formation, believing in the event of a German defeat, it could be used ultimately as the basis for the formation of a Ukrainian national army. And an independent Ukrainian national state couldn't exist without a national army or an armed force of some kind. The Germans never regarded the Ukrainians as allies, never. Neither in their writings or their speeches would they declare that they were officially allies, which says a lot about the relationship between the two. The Ukrainians are very religious people, always have been, and the support of the church in forming the division was significant, as the Ukrainians believed they would be sacrificing short-term form for long-term substance. But it's critical, because the religious element of the Ukrainian community is a very important factor in Ukrainian thinking. Training was thorough and exhaustive, to the extent that serious injuries and even fatalities were commonplace. They were given exhaustive training, and during the training and during the whole time of their service, the Ukrainians were subjected to exceptionally strict discipline. So the idea of them simply doing whatever they wanted and taking matters into their own hands is nonsense. That has been advanced by a number of authors. But the simple fact of the matter is, at all times they were acting under German jurisdiction, and they were subject to a draconian disciplinary code, which in the event of them breaching it would have ultimately, it would have resulted in them even being sent to a penal unit or being shot out of hand. The Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists sent a number of key personnel to serve in the division, and the purpose of their service was to exercise political influence and prevent the Germans from effectively, or to ensure political orientation and prevent the Germanic influence. What I mean by that is The Ukrainians wanted to ensure that it was a Ukrainian unit and it would ultimately serve Ukrainian ends, as opposed to the Germans, who regarded it primarily as a source of manpower to be deployed as they saw fit. In the winter of 1944, the division deployed a battle group to Poland. A number of accusations have been made about its conduct. They haven't been substantiated significantly or with any particular evidence, although the same accusations have been levelled on numerous occasions. By and large, they refer to circumstantial evidence. And all the reports that I have seen, bearing in mind the comment I made about the fact that the division was subjected to draconian military discipline, contradicts the fact that they were allowed effectively to do, as has been claimed, what they wanted and kill, rape and slaughter anybody that they saw fit. In the summer of 1944, the division was sent to the sector of the front where it faced overwhelming odds and where its fate was inevitable. The Germans deployed it in the Brody sector for the oncoming Russian summer offensive of 1944, and they simply stood no chance at all, as did none of the German units involved. But they were the points that I thought were worth mentioning. The fact that the Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists deployed its own personnel to the division. The fact that when the division was deployed at Brody, it stood no opportunity at all of really making significant progress. The fact that the church supported the division and that religious life is an integral part of Ukrainian culture. And the fact that ultimately the division was propelled to the political arena, as was intended by the Ukrainians, inasmuch as at the end of the war it became the focal point of talks between Stalin, Truman, Churchill and the Pope. I can categorically assure you that the Wollin massacre had nothing whatsoever to do with the Galician division. The Waffen SS was a distinct arm of the German armed forces. The Waffen SS means literally armed SS, armed Schutzstaffel. They were combat formations and they were trained and intended for deployment on the front line in a combat role. The issue becomes slightly more clouded in the Germanic divisions because some of the personnel that went to serve in the Waffen SS had previously served as concentration camp guards. But the field units raised from the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, from Galicia, and from the other European countries were based on recruits or enlistees from those countries, the vast majority of them who hadn't served in any capacity whatsoever which related to the Holocaust in any way, shape or form. Some Ukrainians had served in police units prior to enlisting in the division, and those police units might have taken part in anti-Jewish activities. It's very difficult to know for sure because exact records weren't kept, but the division per se had no involvement whatsoever. It was a frontline unit. It was intended, it was raised and it was trained to fight on the front line and not to be used in any capacity directly related to the Holocaust. They're diametrically opposed objectives of the Ukrainians and the Germans because they had conflicting agendas. The influence of the church and the presence of the church had unit priests attached to the division, which was unique within the Waffen SS. The presence of members of the Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists, whose job it was to provide political orientation to the rank and file. They're perhaps the most critical aspects of Volume 1. When I first decided I'd find out about the subject, I telephoned a friend of my father who was still alive. I invited him to the house and I said to him, look, I know my father was in the German army, which is a catch-all for anyone that served in the German uniform. I want to know more about him. And he said to me, he said, well, Michael, your father was in a Waffen SS unit. And I was absolutely mortified because at that age, in this culture, in this environment, I knew very little. I pretty much when I went to school in the UK, the perception was twofold. There were the good guys, the Western Allies, the Americans and the English, and the bad guys, who were the Germans or anyone that fought in a German uniform. And I had this misconception that anyone that served in the SS was 6 foot, no fillings, blonde-haired. I didn't understand the distinction between the Waffen SS and the Allgemeine SS. So I had lots of preconceived ideas that I couldn't reconcile. I certainly couldn't reconcile the fact that my father, who I knew to be a very loving and caring man, had served in a German armed unit which had a reputation for being probably an elite armed unit, and obviously the association with concentration camps, etc. So that's what began the need to discover why he'd served, and it wasn't long before I discovered that he had been conscripted as opposed to volunteered. But as I said, the more I looked into it, the more I found out that different people had been through different things in different ways. So, for example, his circumstances were entirely different to those of his neighbour from the same village. They'd been taken at different times and experienced different things. What I did then is I simply collected all the material I could, everything that had been written. That included Polish publications, Soviet publications, and the very few publications in the English language. And lots of the Polish and the Soviet publications were very anti-division. They all basically accused them of being murderers and war criminals. They were happy to cast aspersions against any member of the division, regardless of the circumstances. But what I discovered very quickly was the accusations that were made, albeit in writing, had no substance. There was no evidence to support them. So in researching the division, I looked at each and every one of those allegations to the best of my ability, and soon discovered that each country that looked or decided to produce publications in relation to the division had their own political agenda, which wasn't necessarily the same as the Ukrainian perspective. So what I tried to do is explore without, I did my best to be as objective as I possibly could, because it's only by being objective and by presenting whatever material you find, you have any credibility. If you seek to distort the evidence that you collect, then you are pretty much falling into the same trap that the Poles and the Soviets did when they published the anti-divisional propaganda that was circulated after the war. They certainly weren't Nazis, that's for sure. They served, in my estimation, and looking back on the work that I've done, I would say that the vast majority of the Ukrainians that served in the unit did so because they had a conviction that ultimately the division would be something that could be used as a bargaining chip to achieve political independence. And that was achieved in April 1945 when the division was recognized as the first division of the Ukrainian National Army, albeit very late in the day, and albeit it wasn't enormously significant in terms of internal developments. The division swore an oath to the Ukrainian nation as opposed to Hitler directly, which they had previously done in 1943 and 1944. Fascism was very popular in the early 20th century. There were the Ukrainian nationalist movement, led by Stefan Bandera, was accused of being fascist. They didn't necessarily. There were similarities between the Ukrainian national movement and the fascists, but they weren't fascists in the sense of national socialists. They were neither Nazi nor believers in, because what the Germans pursued, Lebensraum in the East and the philosophy of the Untermensch, Slavic Untermensch, were diametrically opposed to the Ukrainians themselves. After all, they were the subhumans, which surely must count as an irony, the fact that the subhumans were fighting on behalf of the so-called Herrenvolk, or master race. But don't forget, in the Second World War, I think there was something like 2 million former Soviet citizens fighting with the Germans against the Soviets, which is the biggest defection in history. They weren't fighting for Hitler, they were simply fighting against the Soviet regime. Because they'd lived through the Soviet regime, they'd experienced it firsthand, and frankly, anyone that has any grasp or conception of what the Soviets did in Ukraine wouldn't need to ask why the Ukrainians hate the Russians so much. The documentation was gathered from archives in Germany, in Poland, in America, in the USA, and in England. It was produced without regard to prosperity. So it's reliable. It gives you information that you can rely on, and you can formulate a structure around it. I thought the photographs added a visual aspect that was necessary. The photographs came from a variety of sources. I collected them over the course of 25 years. The Brotherhood of former combatants gave me access to the archive, for which I'm eternally thankful. That's administered by Bohdan Machiv. And I collected a number of pictures from people or veterans to whom I spoke and their families. I tried to get a comprehensive collection of pictures to illustrate every aspect of the division from beginning to end. And that wasn't an easy prospect, because a lot of people, for example, I was sent a number of pictures from Ukraine, and they had belonged to a veteran. The veteran had passed away, and his wife had hidden the pictures in a beehive for 50 years because she was scared if she'd been caught, then clearly she would have been sent to a gulag or had some difficulty with the Soviet authorities. So it's quite extraordinary how the pictures came to survive in some instances, but I used as many as I could to illustrate every single aspect of the division, to allow the reader to engage with the subject and to see every aspect of it, in it, everything that they might want to know or to see. When I gained the trust of some of the community, it started with the immediate circle of my father's friends and acquaintances, people that knew him. When I gained their trust, I found that a great number of them had not spoken to their own families at all about what they'd lived through. When they knew that I understood the technicalities of what they'd experienced, the units they'd fought in, where they had deployed, when they realized that I could actually understand what they were saying to me, they would open up and tell me really quite profound and disturbing things. I had one chap come to see me who told me that he'd been conscripted in 1941 when the Germans invaded to fight with the Germans, and he'd been taken. The reason he had gone is because they had no food, and the prospect of starvation was a very real one for him. He was only a boy, and the Germans asked who was able to, who had different trades, and he put his hand up and said he was a tailor. He wasn't a tailor, but he knew somebody that was, and he'd helped his father's friend at one time in his life. So he was taken away, and he was taken away to the Leningrad front. This is in 1941, in the winter of 1941. And he'd come to my house, he'd come to see me on invitation, and he was speaking to me. And he said he'd never told anybody in his life, but the first time that they'd made these leather jerkins or sheepskin jerkins, and the idea was they were going to take them to the soldiers at the front. And when they'd arrived at the front, they'd walked into the German trenches with the bundles of these garments that they'd made and fabricated. And they could see people standing on sentry duty and people with their weapons, people sitting down. And they called out to them and said, "We've brought you clothing, we've brought you warm thing." He said there was no response at all, no reply. And they got closer and closer. And suddenly he realized that they were all dead. Everybody had frozen to death. They'd frozen to death where they were standing. During the night, the temperature had become excessively cold. And it was simply like a snapshot. Everybody had died where they were. And he said, "I've never told anybody that before, and I've carried it with me all my life." It must be a very disturbing thing to have experienced. from there were other people who would tell me the more I got to know, the more I got to understand, the more they knew I understood. And their children who had no conception of where they came from and what they lived through couldn't really relate to the experiences that they'd had. So I found increasingly towards the end of their lives, more and more of them would tell me things that they had never told their own family before. They hadn't told their family in Ukraine. They hadn't told their family in England. But they would tell me it was almost as if they were trying to unburden their soul. Which sounds very religious, doesn't it? Of things that they'd lived and carried with them all their lives. It was really very emotional, for sure, especially those who were telling me things literally on their deathbed that they'd not told anybody else, and not wanting anyone else to know, not wanting to jeopardize their family, not wanting to worry or concern their family. And I guess they thought these things had moved on and passed, and that they would never have to confront them again. But they were there. They remembered them. Their experiences had been so profound, they'd never forgot them. And I found more and more people telling me these things, which I did my best to record and to relate, because I think they have a value. The experiences that individuals do have a value, and they allow a perspective on the circumstance that existed and allow people to appreciate, perhaps, not really understand fully, but have a better realization of what it is the people lived through. Overall, from beginning to end, about 20,000 men passed through its ranks. Prior to the Battle of Brody, which is the culmination of Volume 1, the majority were, well, it isn't necessarily accurate. The Germans made a lot of this, and so have a lot of other people said that 80,000 people volunteered for the division. Now, I'm not resorting to semantics, but the reality is there was a mandatory requirement for vast swathes of people to enlist. So they weren't strictly speaking volunteers. They enlisted to avoid forced labor. They enlisted because there was a mandatory requirement to do so, and if they didn't, their families or themselves would have been punished. Or they enlisted because they had a nationalistic conviction that what they were doing was the right thing. So initially, there was a central core of ultra-nationalists who thought that they could manipulate the situation to make the division serve their own ends, and to some extent that was diluted by people who joined because of force of circumstance. After the Battle of Brody, virtually all of the people that came to the division, as did my father, were conscripted. The Germans retreated from Ukraine, and they simply they conscripted, as did the Soviets, vast swathes of males between 16 and 60 to serve in the division's ranks. So the reality is, even from day one, it was never a voluntary issue for the vast majority of the people that served in it. Sure, some of them did volunteer, but the choice they had was wait for the Russians to come back or the Soviets to return and go to the gulags, or join the Germans and fight the Soviets, who they hated. What the information that was available was generally inaccurate, and part of the reason for that is because the Ukrainians themselves, the veterans of the unit, had never really gone out of their way to publicize or record the history of the unit in the English language. The only book that had been written which was ultimately written in German, translated into Ukrainian and ultimately English, was the book by the division's German Chief of Staff, Will Dietrich Heik, who published his memoir. The Ukrainians had a number of publications. For example, the veterans published Visti Combatanta, Veterans News, which recounted some stories, but that was in the Ukrainian language. The veterans as a whole never really attempted to consolidate all the information and material they had and publish it. The publications that were available previously suffered because of it. It wasn't that the information wasn't available, that nobody had ever sought to consolidate everything that was there and put it in one place. Skipping ahead a little bit, and it is necessary in this instance, ultimately, there is evidence to suggest that when the war finished, Stalin demanded the repatriation of what he considered to be former Soviet citizens. And the veterans of the division, being predominantly Western but some Eastern Ukrainians, fell into that category. They had lived under the Soviet system. And the British refused to surrender or repatriate the Galicians, almost uniquely. And the evidence is that the British Secret Service had intended to enlist them to fight against the Soviet Union in the event of a Cold War and in the event of them requiring immediate assistance from a military point of view. It is known, there is evidence, and I have spoken to participants who were formerly members of the division who later were recruited by the British Secret Service to perform clandestine operations behind Soviet lines. That was all done in secret. All the documentation in relation to those activities is and still remains classified and will be permanently as far as I can see. So on that basis, because of the classification of that material and because of the ultra secrecy that surrounded it, the Ukrainians didn't want to advertise what they had done and what they were still doing. So it might have seemed in the first instance as if they would want to record what they had done, but I think the fact that a good number of them were involved in these secret activities was sufficient for them not to advertise. Plus, of course, the British media for years has obsessed over the Galician division and accused them of umpteen atrocities repeatedly that have no foundation. Growing up in the UK, the vast majority of people didn't and still don't know the difference between Russia and Ukraine. They just call it Russia. They have no perception at all of the Soviet Union, of the constituent states within it. The Ukrainians themselves couldn't do a great deal because they were still living under Soviet occupation after the war. They were suppressed politically. It was only those that were in the West that would have any kind of opportunity. And in this country, in the UK, there was no, prior to the Ukrainians from the division coming in 1947, there was no real existing community. So there was no culture, no religion, there was no schooling, no language. There was only the Ukrainian veterans themselves, and as I said, the vast majority of them were peasants or simple folk. So I don't think there was the space or the capacity to really recognize the sacrifice that had been made. Most people didn't understand it. Vast majority of people simply referred to Ukrainians as Poles. They saw them as Poles. They perceived them to be Poles. They didn't understand the difference. So the sacrifice was made. I think the sacrifice should be acknowledged. I think the activities and the whole episode of the Galicia division should be recorded for the sake of the legacy and the population in Ukraine now, and the people like myself who have a direct connection with it. But I think between about 1950 and 1990, when Ukraine was independent, I think there was almost a black hole. There was no way of recognizing what happened, no need, or there was no desire or no want to. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, that's when people started looking back and saying, well, there's all this unexplored history that's been suppressed for so long that nobody's had an opportunity to look at. It was only in 1991 that anyone really could approach any Ukrainian and really get something from them, because prior to that they were scared. I'll give you an example of that. My father died in 1970. He was brought here in 1947. Between being brought here in 1947 and his death in 1970, himself and his best friend purchased a boat, which they had moored at Great Yarmouth, which is about 20 miles away, a coastal town from where I live, because up until the point of his death, they were still obsessed with being repatriated to the Soviet Union against their will, to the extent they were prepared to purchase and maintain a boat, which they kept at the sea, so they could make their escape if they needed to. Which is remarkable, really, because they still have, and ironically enough, even today, I still meet some Ukrainians who are obsessed, because of the culture they grew up in, they're just obsessed with secrecy and not being betrayed or sent to a gulag. The existing Ukrainian government after the war was under Soviet occupation. So effectively, they were cut off from any kind of governance at all. The only governance they had was the governance of the country in which they lived and their own kinfolk. And their kinfolk in this country were dominated by their Bandera supporters, which is why that was proliferated in the Ukrainian culture over here for so long. But they didn't know any different. There was nobody to give them any kind of perspective and say these things aren't going to happen. They genuinely lived in fear. And I said, ironically enough, some of them still do to this day. Photographs are very important things, because if you're not academic and if you don't have a real passion for military history, and lots of people don't, it's fairly difficult and dry reading to understand all the different aspects of a military unit and what they did. And I thought it really, the photographic element adds another dimension to the book. It's a physical portrayal. A picture tells 1,000 stories, and I tried my best to put together a comprehensive collection of pictures from various sources that really would. So even if people just wanted to look at the pictures, they could do that without having to delve into sometimes the quite dry reading of the text and all the references that go with it. I guess I've got about 2,000. Yeah, 2,000 photographs. But they have been collected with blood, sweat, money, and tears. not in that order. In the early days, I'd say in the first book was published after 15 years, and I would say after probably 10 years, I shouldn't think I had more than about 12 pictures. Not that they didn't exist and not that people didn't have them, but they were hidden, or they were reluctant to give them to me, or they didn't want them displayed or published in their lifetime, or they didn't know what I was going to do with them. They thought I was going to publish them with different captions and things that they weren't happy with. So it was really a concerted effort on my part to put together the collection of pictures, which I successfully did. And that's one of the achievements that I'm most proud of. There are sufficient pictures there. I know the source of lots of pictures now, but they're beyond me for a number of reasons. Some cost too much. Some people are reluctant to give them to me. Some are in private collections. But in conjunction with those that I already have, if I could get access to 4 collections that I know of, which I've been working on for a number of years, there would be sufficient, surely, to produce a superb pictorial account of the division. The reluctance is because the pictures that I've got in mind are in the hands of collectors. And they're not necessarily Ukrainians, and they don't necessarily have any interest or knowledge of what they've got. They're just people that want these things. And it's very difficult to persuade people like that, because for them, it tends to be a monetary thing. I was offered one collection for $25,000, but that's an awful lot of money for 40 photographs. The main problematic aspects of the initial formation of the division are looking at the people that enlisted and looking at their experiences prior to serving in a division. Quite a number, in my experience, came to the division having served with the Germans in various other units, auxiliary police formations, for example. And those auxiliary units took part in all sorts of activities. So lots of people that served in those units are reticent to discuss what went on in those units, why they joined them, what they did. So that's been probably the hardest thing to address, where people came, the antecedents prior to serving with the division. Again, in my experience, when I receive messages from people like myself who are the son of veterans, they'll say to me, thank you for publishing the book. I've read it. I have a better understanding now than I did. My father wouldn't tell me anything about the war. Only when he got drunk, occasionally would he say things, or only when he was in the company of his friends who shared similar experiences. So I think that's what it comes down to. The information is there. People want an opportunity to say things, but for one reason or another, they feel it's not prudent to do so. That the people that enlisted were like you and me. They were no different. They weren't necessarily people that they were from all sorts of backgrounds, academics to farmers. And the one thing that they shared, the conviction that they did share, were they were Ukrainian nationalists. They were patriots. They loved their country above and beyond everything. And if serving in a German uniform allowed them to fight the Soviets who were occupying their country, then it was a lesser of two evils. That's quite reassuring from my perspective to discover that. I haven't met one person that served as a mercenary or who didn't have a real deep-rooted conviction to their own national Ukrainian heritage. From the first picture in the book, which is, again, if you look at the book, the first picture is of bodies. And the first picture, I chose that quite carefully because when the Soviets occupied Ukraine for 2 years, 1939 to 1941, they imprisoned the Ukrainian nationalists. Anyone that was seen to be, anyone that they felt was a threat, a perceived threat, anyone that had that was a Ukrainian nationalist that they could identify, anyone active in the nationalist movement. The Russians, the Soviets, imprisoned them. And before they retreated in 1941, they didn't have time, because the German invasion took place so quickly, they didn't have time to evacuate the jails. So they simply slaughtered the inmates of those jails, Ukrainian nationalists, no more, no less. They weren't Jews, they were Ukrainians. And they, in some instances, they cemented up the doors, they threw hand grenades and dynamite into the cells, they simply shot them or slaughtered them. So when the Germans came in 6 days later, they found thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainians who had been slaughtered and killed in the jails. And the Germans made a great deal of propaganda from that. They publicized, they took pictures and published these pictures and posted them all around the Ukrainian cities so they could see what the Soviets had done, not that the Ukrainians didn't know. And that particular picture, the first picture I used in Volume 1, was kept by a Ukrainian veteran of the division. And if you look at the state of the photograph, it's really quite well worn. He kept it in his pocket for the duration of the entire war, all the time, because that, for him, was a permanent reminder of what he was fighting for. He wasn't fighting for Hitler in Germany. He was fighting for the sake of the people that had been taken and killed by the Soviets. Prior to the German invasion, there were a couple of Ukrainian units, or units comprised of Ukrainian personnel, Nightingale and Roland. But the reality is these were principally for propaganda. They only featured between the two of them a few hundred men. They were of no military significance whatsoever. The Germans only started to retreat from their philosophy of the Untermensch, the subhumans, in 1943, by which time Stalingrad had taken place and the Germans were losing on all fronts. So it wasn't until the Germans were compromised that they decided to relent and expand or certainly jettison some of their previous philosophies, not that they ever did entirely. So there was no real opportunity to join the Germans or to support them. It only came due to force of circumstance and the fact that the Germans were losing the war. I have spoken on the division in this country. I've spoken in Scotland about the division and in Toronto. I have visited the Ukrainian Research and Documentation Centre in Toronto. But I've never spoken about the division anywhere in Europe. I'd be happy to do that, because my reason for so doing is I want as many people as possible to have a better understanding of the division for the benefit of the families and the generations who missed out. So I'm keen to promote the division and my work, and I'm keen to help or assist anybody that wants to contact me. But I haven't ever given I haven't ever spoken about the division publicly in Europe other than in this country. What I have achieved in the course of the 25 years I've been studying the division, I think I have become, because I always endeavoured to produce an objective account, I think I have established a degree of credibility which allows people to regard me as a serious historian and a serious source of information on the Galician division. And not a partisan. Not a partisan view. Somebody they can come to and ask a question, and I'll give them an honest answer based on the evidence and the supporting documentation that I've collected. I feel I have a debt to Ukrainian culture, and I can't really explain that other than to say that it's just a conviction that I have. I feel a responsibility to record the events as they happen, because in my eyes nobody else has ever taken the time and trouble to devote themselves to this particular subject. I don't feel, worthy is the wrong word, I don't feel as if I'm able to set foot in Ukraine until such time as I'm in a position to produce something and say, well, this is my contribution, this is what I have done, this is my endeavor, my effort, however flawed it might be. Before I can do that, and I still don't think I've done it, I don't feel as if I've got a right to go. Does that sound strange to you? And to be perfectly honest, I said the latest project I'm working on, which I want to be the contributions based entirely on the contributions and experience of the 6 individuals. If I can complete that task, I will feel as if I have a right to go to the country, and I can say to anybody, I have done as much as I can do. But and until I have, I always feel as if I haven't done enough to earn the right to call myself or to refer directly to my. It's an odd situation, but it's true. And I realize it might sound absurd, but that's just the way it is. I feel I have a debt. I feel I have a duty, and that duty, that perceived duty I have, dictates my attitude to the country and to the people there. It's a very odd situation, and I said I understand that might sound like a ridiculous thing for me to say, but it's the truth. But the way I look at it is that the people that I'm writing about sacrificed, well, they were willing to sacrifice their life for their country. That's what they want. They believed in their country. They were patriots. They were genuine patriots. And if they were prepared to sacrifice their lives, what am I doing? How does that compare? Somebody that spends a bit of money, a bit of time researching a book, there's no comparison at all for someone else who's prepared to put their life on the line. It's the same objective. We're both supporting the country that we love and that we hold dear. But in my way of thinking, their contribution is incomparable compared to the effort that I make. I'll tell you something else. When I started, when I initially contacted a number of institutions in Germany and other countries, they wouldn't allow me access to their material because I had no qualifications. I wasn't affiliated with a university or any institution of any kind whatsoever. I undertook all my work as a private individual. And that's why I sincerely believe in the presentation of the work that I've done, because I had no ulterior motive. I didn't have anyone paying to come up with a particular line. I didn't have any affiliation. There was no personal objective in as much as I wasn't looking to secure a vast amount of money from it or a qualification from it, which allowed me to be perfectly objective. But I found in the first 5 or 6 years, I couldn't get any cooperation at all from official institutions because they simply wouldn't recognize what I was doing. I've been very careful and very methodical. Every statement that I've made and every piece of evidence that I've presented has been substantiated. And if you substantiate what you write, if you provide evidence, it has credibility. If it has credibility, credibility, it's believable. When you start making unsubstantiated claims, that's when you fall foul of everything. You have no credibility at all because you can't say, look, this is the evidence that I've got. But I'm self-taught, for right or wrong, for better or for worse. That's how I went about it. I wouldn't recommend other people necessarily do the same thing because it hasn't been fun. But it's an exorcism, I suppose, a personal exorcism of, as I said, really what I feel to be a compelling duty. I would dearly love that to happen. The issue with translation into Ukrainian are the syndication rights from the publishers. And I'm not sure if there's a way around it. But I would dearly love the books to appear in the Ukrainian language. When the latest books were published, I spent something in the region of £500 that's English currency, obtaining additional copies of the book from the publisher to dispatch to people all over the world at my own expense, because I knew that there are people that had contributed or that the books would be of value. And since that time, I've been inundated with requests, especially from Ukraine, people asking me for the books, not because they're too mean to buy them, but because they're not able to access them as readily as I am. Now, I have a partner and a family, a young family. I'm not particularly wealthy, and I always do whatever I can to assist. So I make sure that institutions have copies. I make sure that prominent people who are active in the community have copies. And slowly but surely, I'm working my way through to making sure as many copies are available as possible. I would love to see it in Ukrainian. More than anything, if I have a life's goal left, I suppose it's twofold. To complete my final work, which would, in my eyes, give me the right to go to Ukraine and to say, well, I'm entitled to be here. And the other thing is to see the works published in the Ukrainian language. They can be circulated, they can be read and readily available to the Ukrainian-speaking population at large. They're my two life ambitions. More than anything else, that's what I want. And it's difficult because books of this nature are difficult to translate. Translation is fraught with difficulty. You can one single word mistranslated can give a completely wrong impression of what the author intends to say, and there are lots of technical terms which makes it a very daunting task. But I feel the contribution it would make to the Ukrainian-speaking people would benefit from the availability of this work in their language, and that's something that I would dearly love to see. So I'm perfectly happy to talk to you every night for the next 2 months, because the truth is that there's a lot there, things that I dismiss and don't necessarily give a second thought to, but because I've never been prompted or asked to consider it. So there's a lot that needs to be said. There's a lot that could be said. I think ultimately it's to everyone's benefit that it is said. It's a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.